Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and in this video, I'm responding to Rationality Rules on his video on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. This is part one of a three-part series, so if you'd like the link or the playlist to all three, check for it in the description. It's real easy to find. In Stephen's original video, which I've linked in the description of this video, he gives a total of 6 objections to the Kalam Cosmological Argument. The first 2 are against the conclusion, the next 2 are against the argument, and then the following 2, the last 2, are against proponents of the argument. So part 1 deals with objections 1 and 2, part 2 in this series deals with objections 3 and 4, and part 3 deals with objections, you guessed it, 5 and 6. So, has an 8-minute YouTube video literally debunked an argument that's been around for literally thousands of years? The short answer to this question is no. The long answer to this question is no. So before I address the first 2 objections, I need to make some initial comments. So first, Stephen's debunking of the Kalam Cosmological Argument is intentionally limited to what he calls the original, I'm using these a lot, the original Kalam Cosmological Argument. So let's watch.
Now, while there are serious flaws with Craig's additional arguments, and while this video will indeed briefly cover some of these flaws, the main focus of this video is the original Kalam Cosmological Argument.
So by original Kalam Cosmological Argument, Stephen is really referring to the premise-conclusion form of the argument, which goes like this. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. From there it follows the conclusion, the universe has a cause. So we'll refer to this as the core syllogism, and this is a term that I'll be using throughout this series, so just keep it in mind. When I say the core syllogism, I'm talking about the premise-conclusion form of the argument. So what Stephen is saying here is that he's intentionally limiting his debunking of the Kalam Cosmological Argument to just the core syllogism. All of the additional arguments, all of the additional evidence is largely going to be ignored. This immediately starts to raise all sorts of red flags. By not addressing the arguments that go beyond the core syllogism, he not only misses out on a lot of potential answers to his objections, but he's also attacking like the weakest possible version of the argument. And this really misleads the audience into thinking that the wider Kalam discussion is just as weak. But think about this for a second. Like, can you honestly criticize a movie by only watching the first 5 minutes? Like, the opening sequence, first 5 minutes of the film might raise some interesting questions, but you can't give an informed view if you're not going to watch the whole thing. Likewise, we need to look at the whole Kalam discussion, not just the core syllogism, if we want to make sure we're not misrepresenting it. My second initial comment is that this video is not meant to bash Stephen Woodford. This is an attack on him or his person. I want to engage his ideas. To quote C.S. Lewis, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered. All right, let's move on to his objections. So Stephen's first objection says that even if we accept the conclusion of the Kalam, and remember we're talking about the core syllogism, that doesn't even remotely support God's existence. That's actually what he says. Let's watch.
The first point to be raised, in my opinion, is that even if we accept the Kalam Cosmological Argument in its entirety, all it would prove is that there was a cause of the universe, and that's it. It doesn't even suggest, let alone prove, that this cause was a being. And it certainly doesn't suggest that this cause was a being that is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, personal and moral. That is one hell of a leap. Hence, even if accepted, the argument doesn't remotely support theism.
The first thing to note is just a reminder, really, that the only reason this objection is even possible is because Stephen has intentionally limited his discussion to the core syllogism. This would kind of be like complaining that Tony Stark isn't Iron Man because he's not Iron Man in like the first 5 minutes of Iron Man 1. I mean, yeah, Tony doesn't build the Mark I suit in like the first 5 minutes of the film, but you got to keep watching. Don't complain about stuff not happening if you're not going to watch the whole movie. And so just like movies come in stages, So do most cosmological arguments. The first stage of cosmological arguments make a case for some distinct feature of reality, like an unmoved mover, a first cause, some kind of necessary being, etc. The second stage ties this unique feature to God. And the Kalam cosmological argument has both of these stages. The first stage argues for a cause for the universe, and then the second stage argues that only God, or something like God, is the only viable candidate. So now let's watch how Dr. William Lane Craig, the most famous defender of the Kalam cosmological argument, whom Stephen is well aware of, let's watch how he defends stage 2 of the Kalam.
What properties must this cause of the universe possess? This cause must itself be uncaused, because we've seen that an infinite series of causes is impossible. It is therefore the uncaused first cause. It must transcend space and time, since it created space and time. Therefore, it must be immaterial and non-physical. It must be unimaginably powerful, since it created all matter and energy. This uncaused first cause must also be a personal being. For it's the only way to explain how an eternal cause can produce an effect with a beginning like the universe. Here's the problem. If a cause is sufficient to produce its effect, then if the cause is there, the effect must be there too. For example, the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees Celsius. If the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. Now, the cause of the universe is permanently there, since it is timeless. So why isn't the universe permanently there as well? Why did the universe come into being only 14 billion years ago? Why isn't it as permanent as its cause? The answer to this problem is that the first cause must be a personal being, endowed with freedom of the will. His creating the universe is a free act, which is independent of any prior determining conditions. So his act of creating can be something spontaneous and new. Freedom of the will enables one to get an effect with a beginning from a permanent, timeless cause. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
So according to Dr. Craig, the cause of the universe must be immaterial, spaceless, timeless, pretty powerful, and also personal. I mean, that sounds a bit like God, right? Now, someone might respond to this by saying, well, yeah, this kind of maybe sounds like God, but it's not really God. God is supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, all good. And the being that Dr. Craig arrives at is like nothing like this. 2 quick points on this. First, what Stephen actually says is that the Kalam doesn't even, quote, remotely support theism. However, I take it as pretty obvious that even if the Kalam doesn't get you all the way to classical theism, it still rules out a bunch of possibilities like atheism, naturalism, materialism, and so on. And this is just a little probability stuff, but ruling out possibilities causes you to redistribute the probabilities, which basically means that the probability for theism goes up by default. That's just sort of basic probability. And so if the Kalam raises the probability of theism, then obviously it supports theism. And to be honest, I've never really understood why atheists raise this objection to the argument because, I mean, it rules out atheism. So second, it's a mistake to assume that Craig's stage 2 case is the only stage 2 case out there for the Kalam. I interviewed a philosopher recently named Justin Mooney, where he argues that even from the argument from fine-tuning, you can go directly from that argument, sort of abductively, but you can go directly from that argument all the way to a perfect being. And so if he's right, we can actually go straight from an argument like the Kalam to a perfect being like God. And again, the link to that interview is in the description of this video. Now, there are other really serious problems with Stephen's first objection, which I don't have time to go into, but my main point here is that it's incredibly misleading to say that the Kalam doesn't remotely support theism when the wider discussion of it clearly does. Again, you can't honestly criticize a movie by only watching the first 5 minutes. You've got to watch the whole thing. Failing to do so misrepresents your target. All right, let's move on to his second objection. His second objection says that the Kalam is not a first cause argument. Let's watch.
A second problem that arises, even if we accept the argument, is that while it would prove that the universe had a cause, it wouldn't prove that this cause itself was without a cause. Or in other words, it wouldn't prove that a first cause existed, which for a first cause argument is pretty damn ridiculous.
Again, we see Stephen sort of selectively consider only the core syllogism and ignore everything else. For Stephen, the core syllogism doesn't establish a first cause, therefore the whole Kalam discussion doesn't establish a first cause. Now, we've seen why this is actually a misrepresentation of the Kalam, and it's actually guilty of the fallacy of composition. But I'd like to make another point here, one that Stephen's followers and his listeners might not be aware of. In his published work, Dr. Craig gives several lines of evidence in support of the second premise of the Kalam, that the universe began to exist, and at least 2 of these rule out an infinite regress of causes. In other words, there must be a first cause. Now, I can't go into the arguments in detail. I want to try to keep this video short, but I will offer a brief sketch of one of the arguments, and I'll also offer an affiliate link in the description if you want to investigate further. The argument I'll highlight is called the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things. Basically, Dr. Craig argues that the concept of infinity is just sort of like a make-believe concept that exists in your mind. It can't exist in reality. To quote him, if an actually infinite number of things could exist, this would spawn all sorts of absurdities. That's on page 118 of Reasonable Faith. So one of the absurdities that arises is that you can subtract 2 equal quantities from infinity and get 2 contradictory answers. And that's just completely absurd. I can't take 5 apples from 10 apples and wind up with anything other than 5 apples. I can't end up with contradictory numbers of things when I subtract from things that actually exist. And so this shows that the concept of infinity is just, like I said, sort of a made-up concept in our minds that we sort of toy around with. It doesn't exist in reality. And from this argument, we learn that an actually infinite number of things can't exist. And so there can't be an infinite number of causes that stretch back forever. In other words, there must be a first cause. And again, we see how important it is to engage the full argument, to watch the whole cosmological movie instead of just limiting yourself to the core syllogism. You'll end up complaining about stuff that's been answered literally decades ago. Now, to be fair, Stephen acknowledges that there are additional arguments that go beyond the core syllogism. But the problem is that he treats these arguments as a bad thing and even mocks them.
To be fair, the proponents of this argument do indeed offer additional arguments in the attempt to assert that the cause of the universe must be without a cause. But the point I'm trying to make here and now is that the Kalam Cosmological Argument, by itself, is pretty damn trivial. And hence, the proponents of this argument almost always employ additional arguments to reach their conclusions, including the likes of Craig.
So Stephen says proponents of the argument employ additional arguments to reach their conclusions. Just think about that for a second. They employ additional arguments to reach their conclusions. In what possible world is it a bad thing to have additional arguments for your conclusions? I mean, is Stephen trying to tell us that atheists would have more respect for theists if we had less arguments for our positions? Now, here's something that I think we can pretty much all agree is actually bad. Claiming that you've debunked an argument because its proponents have more arguments for their conclusions. It appears that Stephen may not understand how arguments work in philosophy. It's not the job of the core syllogism to do all the work. Good arguments are complex and have multiple parts, all of which are doing their own thing. So what Stephen sees as a weakness is actually a strength. Instead of assuming or smuggling in premises, every single aspect, every premise of the Kalam has been thoughtfully considered and defended by additional independent arguments. That's exactly what good philosophy looks like. In summary, we saw that Stephen intentionally limited his discussion of the Kalam to the core syllogism, the premise-conclusion form of the argument, and he's ignored everything else. This would be like saying you've quote-unquote debunked Iron Man because Tony Stark is an Iron Man in the opening sequence. That's just not how it works. In response to his first objection that the Kalam doesn't remotely support theism, I pointed out that this is very misleading. The Kalam comes in two stages. The first stage establishes a cause of the universe, and the second stage establishes that the cause is God or something like God. We then looked at Dr. William Lane Craig's stage 2 analysis of the cause of the universe and saw that the wider discussion of the Kalam clearly supports theism and actually does so by default from a probabilistic standpoint. In response to his second objection that the Kalam isn't a first cause argument, I pointed out that A, the wider discussion of the Kalam rules out an infinite regress of causes, and then B, looking down on the fact that your opponents have more arguments against your position is just philosophically naive. Alright, I hope you enjoyed part 1 of this series. Remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, hit the little bell, so you can be alerted when we post new videos or go live. Part 2 of this series deals with Stephen's next 2 objections, that the Kalam equivocates on the term universe, and that everything is the result of creation out of material. If you're already in the playlist, just sit tight, you'll be taken to the next video automatically, but if not, check for it in the description. And just remember, Christianity is objectively true.